Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska. I'm the co-founder of the Final Girls Collective and your podcast host. I am also a lifelong David Cronenberg fan. And let me tell you, it is a good time to be a Cronenberg fan. For last week, the UK saw the theatrical release of his return to the genre space for the first time since 1999's Existence. Crimes of the Future premiered in Cannes, where I saw it and shared my very early thoughts on the film in the Dispatch from Cannes, which you can listen to on this main feed. And since then, I had the chance not just to deep dive into the film with The Independent's film critic Clarice Lockery, a deep dive that you can listen over on our Patreon, but also speak to some of the crew behind Crimes of the Future. So what you're about to hear is a bonus episode with 2 interviews. First, you'll listen to my conversation with the heads of department of the prosthetics team, Alexandra and Monica Pavez. And follow directly by that, you're going to listen to my chat with Cronenberg's long-term producer, Robert Lantos. Crimes of the Future has been in cinemas for a week now, and hopefully a lot of you have had the chance to see it, but if you haven't yet, this conversation does not contain any spoilers. And once you have, if you do want to listen to our deep dive and you want to support the podcast while we're on hiatus before we launch our next season, you can either leave us a little review, give us a follow on Apple Podcasts and Spotify Podcast, follow us on Twitter and Instagram at The Final Girls UK, or support us on Patreon. We're publishing bonus episodes, deep dive reviews, and mini-series according to the different levels. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at AnnaBDemented. And with all that said, please enjoy my conversations with the team behind Crimes of the Future. It's a very swear-friendly podcast, so feel free if you are so inclined.
It's been very buttoned up until now, so that's great.
No formalities here.
Excellent.
So thank you so much for giving up a little bit of your time. I wanted to start really starting at the beginning, and I wanted to ask you guys, how did you first meet David Cronenberg?
So we had a very different meeting with him than I think most ultimately. We do a Canadian horror television series called Slasher that he had he was playing the lead in season 4. So he obviously his character, well, sorry, spoiler alert to everyone, his character doesn't make it. So at the sort of beginning of filming the season, he came in and we life casted, as much of him as humanly possible. And the beginnings of his death was us putting a prosthetic makeup on his chest. And then towards the end of the season, we had an entire likeness body of him, which he obviously didn't see or interact with until we had, there was sort of like an EPK and press day I think it was our last day on set. And we sort of wheeled the body out just as a here's you. And, that was a lovely little moment. And then he reached out a few weeks later about doing some further work, which just sort of snowballed from there, which was great.
Yeah. But it was a hilarious thing, even when he was in here, of doing the life cast, because he joked around a lot about how he's, put actors through this process many times. And, we always sort of apologize in advance. It's never a pleasant thing to have happen. It's not horrifying, but it's, it's an ordeal. And he was very, kind and joking about the fact that, I've put many a person through this, so it's about time I've had the favor returned. So it was very lovely.
So you got the job for Crimes of the Future by putting David Cronenberg through a body horror experience of his own. I love it.
We just put it for a ringer, and somehow that worked in the long run. It was all good. Actually, even the day that he had come in for his life cast, we had yet to do the makeup on him or anything like that, and so it was sort of flying blind, and that, you know, there's no reason for him to have any idea who we were. But being the lovely, humble human being that he is, he sort of had mentioned like, well, you know, I'm making a film this summer, and like, we're going to need some things. And we were like, great, like, good luck with your film, because there's no world ever that, you know, that would be the case. And then it all just came around full circle in this really lovely way. It was great.
Were you fans of his work beforehand? And kind of as another add-on question to that, when he did reach out with the script for Crimes of the Future, what did you make of it?
Oh man. So I mean, as
sacrilege. Let's just like put this out there to everyone who's going to be very disappointed in us.
No, I mean, so I don't say neither of us are like huge, like diehard horror fans. Like we watch it and we are aware of it, in that like that's the world we inhabit by doing all of this work. And you know, in terms of David's work, there was an awareness of his catalog, and we'd seen a couple of his films. But, and I mean, being Canadian, also you know who David Cronenberg is if you work in film. But there wasn't this apprehension in terms of meeting him, or like, just because, I don't know, maybe we probably should have been more, you know, intimidated. But yeah, there was awareness of his work, but it wasn't, I don't think it was a hindrance to getting into the world of the film, because when we were presented with the script, again, it was still sort of a moment of like, is this for real? Like, are we reading a David Cronenberg script in the sense of we might work on it? I guess we are. So I think once it was finally happening, it was also quick that we were kind of like, great, whatever it is, yes, like we're in. The whatever you're making, yes, we're in.
And it was honestly such a short time in between everything happening, and we had a really short runway in terms of getting things built in Canada, and then flying over to Athens to continue building and then shoot. That there wasn't any time to get nervous or sort of overthink it. It's only now that we look back being like, damn, okay, well, that could have been fucking terrifying.
Yeah.
But here we are. Exactly. And I'm sort of glad that we did not have time to overthink it, because that never helps anything.
Yeah.
And can I ask you then about the actual process of working on the film? So you get given a script. I imagine there's meetings and conversations and David's vision. How do you work then? How do you take that and transform it into I was thinking before when I was writing the questions, how to refer to the designs and the people in the film, because like, they're not really creatures, they're people. But, you know, slightly different with kind of additional parts or additional organs, which I imagine creatively is quite an interesting space where you kind of need to make it futuristic, but not so futuristic that it seems completely unfathomable.
Yeah. I mean, kind of, I think how we thought of them from a design standpoint was that they're performance artists. And if you think of it, even the way that, you know, we have performance artists now where people are doing fairly extreme things in the name of art. And then if you kind of, you know, fast forward that or move that forward into a world where you can do things like that to your body and not die or get crazy infected, or all of the things that would normally be an obstacle to do that sort of stuff now. I mean, it doesn't seem that far-fetched really to think of, you know, when you compare what some people will do for performance and for art now to, if you had access to your own body in that way, I imagine people would do things like that. So it was kind of this idea of, even from David, of, you know, what do you think looks cool that someone could do with their own body? And then if you sort of also inject the idea that someone can grow new organs or, you know, remove them at will, then it kind of opens you up to like, sure, let's just see what looks cool and, you know, what makes sense within the world that's been created. Yeah.
Working with Carol Spear, his, you know, forever production designer, one was a dream, and two, just in having a million conversations with her and David about, sort of where we were with everything, it was just a really lovely, open, collaborative conversation. There were, some directions that were provided, and Carol had some existing concept art that we sort of loosely based the beginnings of things on. So some of Brecken's Brecken's system of organs sort of existed as a whole from a visual standpoint, and then we did a lot of tweaking and broke it down into individual pieces that could then be created so that they were a tangible thing. But yeah, it was a really open world of communication where everyone was sort of throwing out ideas and ultimately just seeing what we all aesthetically thought looked like a neat thing, which is rare.
Well, even like, for example, like the Odile character who gets her face sliced open in the room of mirrors and whatnot. From a script standpoint, it was just like, I think it was something along the lines of like her face is, it reveals with her face is just cut open. And so you're like, okay, her face is cut open. What does that mean? And like, they went through a couple design iterations of when you say cut open, is it this? Is it that? What are we looking for? And even like the clinic ear man makeup, it started out as he has one extra set of ears behind his own ears, and it sort of evolved into just as many as you could fit on him in the amount of time that we had. And so there was definitely jumping off points. And then I think, I'm sure even David getting excited about the stuff as well was like, oh man, let's see where we can take this. Like,
never mind 2 years.
Yeah, fuck, how long it takes.
Yeah, cover it.
Just in the ear man, how many ears does he end up having actually?
He had 36 ears on. Yeah.
Okay.
36 ears, or no, sorry, 34 ears, and then the 2 other pieces.
Right.
So, yeah.
And there were a bunch more. It's just like, here's how many we can fit on if we're going to shoot anything today.
Yeah.
and this kind of feeds nicely into my next question. Kind of, were you concerned, and it might sound weird, but were you concerned with making the designs and the body modification of it all, the prosthetics, kind of look beautiful at the same time? Because I don't, people have called it body horror and stuff, but it is kind of about the body a lot, but I never found any of it, horrific to look at. In fact, it was very beautiful. It was very aesthetic, very almost pleasing in the way that, it is performance art.
I think that's a one. Thank you. That's wonderful. That's what we were going for, and I think also what David was going for, and it feels great that that's the perception. But I think David's also said many times that he has never called himself the master of body horror. It's always been the audiences being like, David Cronenberg, and as much as obviously he, I'm sure, takes that title for exactly what it is, his entire thought process, at least from our perspective, and the way that he likes to talk about the body is very much from a beautiful space. This is about like learning to make peace with what we are, and what we are is sort of out of our control, and just having to evolve within that. So it felt none of it ever felt like it was supposed to be horrific or too intense. It's I mean, I guess it is intense, but in the appropriate ways where it should be poking your brain a little bit to think about how we all function and what we're all made of, and ultimately how it's completely out of our hands for the most part.
Well, even in that, the only specific note I think I remember us getting in terms of the look of things was that it not be bloody.
Okay.
That there be fluids, and that it was still a body, but that it shouldn't be, didn't want it to feel like traumatic. None of these things were meant to shock from a blood and gore standpoint. It was because, like you said, it's performance, really, that it was people showing you their insides and whatnot in a way that they are intending to be beautiful. And so I think that coming from that, it makes sense that is the sense that people get from it, because yeah, no, I mean, without blood, it's a lot of the things when you think about it, like looking at a lot of organs, even just as they are, it's fascinating. Like it's beautiful to look at. So it's kind of not until you see the trauma of blood and being cut open in that way that it becomes bad.
I have one really lovely memory in speaking of, Saul or Vigo's insides during his performance. And it, very much being the conversation with David about the lack of blood, but like we knew from doing a gajillion surgery things, but in a television world, everybody wants blood on everything. But it's like there isn't blood in surgery unless things are going poorly. Like it's very controlled.
It's
like
very controlled. There's no gushing geysers of things unless things have gone off the rails.
Exactly. And this was such a precise, calculated performance between, Leia and Vigo's characters that it made sense that this was not a blood fest. There is, of course, fluids and, little bits of glistening things and so on and so forth, but it was not about, hook up the tank and let's do this thing.
And on that note, actually, I wanted to a lot of the movie, and well, I guess a lot of performance art in this sense that kind of works with the body and with body modification, as much as the performances, the extraction and the surgery itself. Huge chunks of the film are then about actually Saul healing. And kind of giving himself enough time to rest or just to exist in this body that keeps transforming itself or growing new organs. Kind of, did you have conversations as well about what, even though it's not visible, kind of like what that might look like, the scars, the healing, what it looks like once the show is done, for lack of a better expression?
I mean, there was a few initial conversations about, because even from a design standpoint, it was, what does healing look like in this world? Clearly they're not, infection and that kind of thing isn't really a concern. So from trying to root it in a sort of reality that we could understand and that the audience would relate to, what does that look like? And I think ultimately what was landed on was that it remain a bit non-specific.
Okay.
That, that it, I don't know, it didn't seem to feel as important that people focus on, well, like, why doesn't he have more scars or this or that or whatever, that it was kind of extraneous to the rest. So there was conversations about it, but I think, it seemed like the final thing we landed on was that it remained a bit abstract of like, we're not really sure how that happened.
That's where the sci-fi comes in.
Yeah, we'll let people sort of imagine. Whatever people will imagine will be far crazier than whatever we would specifically point out as being the thing.
And I do know that when we were speaking specifically about scarring, because there was an evolution to that, as Monica just said, like we concluded, like Saul as his own entity is, his body is working in a very different way than many others. But then when it came to Scott Speedman's character Dotrice and sort of his group of humans, because they were on a mission to sort of physically change themselves. This wasn't something, from my perspective at least, that was naturally happening. It was naturally happening to them, but they were interacting with what that evolution looked like. So there is a moment where we do see some scars on their stomachs that are clearly very different and older, and they've been playing around with their bodies in a very different way than it seemed Saul did. So I think that was maybe the only, again, not super on purpose, because everything was very much like, let's leave it, this is everyone's own journey to sort of walk through on their own. But that's the only thing that really stayed in my mind, is like, this is a scar. Saul is his own entity,
Yeah.
And can you talk a little bit, we've brought up kind of performance artists and body modification a little bit in our chat, but did you look at real people for inspirations for the design, kind of real performance artists or real, I'm not sure, kind of body modification artists, perhaps, if that's a word for them?
Yeah, we did more, honestly, I think more specifically for the design of Leia's character Caprice's subdermal implants, because there was actually quite a fair bit of design back and forth, because in the script I think it was just written as a crown, but then when it came to deciding, okay, what do these actually look like, I know David, he didn't want it to seem like, again, he was very specific about it wanting to look beautiful. That he didn't want the whatever implant she had to sort of, I don't know, not to say that any sort of body modification would take away from anyone's beauty, but that it definitely adds a layer in terms of how someone would perceive that person. And he didn't really want it to change kind of her established look and I guess overall aesthetic. So there was a lot of, looking at what do actual subdermal implants look like. And yeah, ultimately, I think the decision ended up just being to keep it fairly minimal, in that from a story standpoint, she wanted to do something, but it wasn't this extreme thing that ultimately she's not quite a performance artist in the same way that Saul or the Odile character or Clinic is. She's sort of like, I don't know, dallying with with what it would be to modify your own body. So yeah, I don't know if we look at anyone specific.
There was the only other thing that I can think is that there is or was a woman. This is going to be a terrible bit of information where I'm not going to know a name or a timeline or a country. There's this woman somewhere, she might still be alive, who pretty notoriously did do some live surgical performance art. And that was very early conversations for the Odile surgery, was not mimicking that in any way, but sort of using that as a jumping off point of like, wow, this is a very, I mean, in my opinion, amazing, but pretty extreme thing to be putting out there and doing to yourself. So we did, I cannot believe I don't remember her name. I'm so sorry. You'll just have to insert some blurb being like, her name was, and she is from Germany. I'm not sure. But yeah, that was the only other sort of reference point in terms of people doing extreme things in front of an audience, not with any real intention of this becoming, more conventionally beautiful. This was just about interacting with your body and sort of being in control of that.
And finally, really to start wrapping up our conversation, I wanted to ask you guys, was there what was perhaps the most challenging element to design for you from a design perspective, and kind of what did it feel like when you actually saw it in the flesh?
I mean, for different reasons than other things, I think the Brecken body and his system and how that all interacts, because of, again, spoiler for anyone who hasn't seen it, but he gets cut open. Trying to, first of all, there was, the initial design of what the system looks like altogether. But then just from the practicality of making it, you have to break it down into like, okay, this is this thing, which it's not it's not a liver, it's not a lung, it's not anything, it's new things, but it had to be organs that connect together, but also exist individually. And then figuring out like, okay, these have to be inside him, we're gonna cut him open. And, they're playing it in the movie as if this was already done. And then he was kind of put back together. And I don't know, things like that, I always find it's interesting when you're given that brief at the beginning of this has to happen. And you're like, okay, cool. Yeah, no problem. It's in the back of your mind as a list. And then it comes to making it. And you're like, okay, cool. We got to put some organs into a body that's intact. So then I'm going to get cut open. And again, try to make it all look beautiful still, because even that, while it's a shocking thing in the movie because it's a child, it's also, there's like that element of beauty to it. So it's, how do you make this system for a kid and make it look beautiful while also shocking, which I found particularly challenging to like decide on the look of all of those things.
Yeah, totally. I think just in terms of a technical build standpoint, Vigo's ports, for as straightforward as I mean, it wasn't straightforward in that we obviously shopped a gajillion designs before we decided on what that look was and placement and so on and so forth. But then it sort of becomes the secondary conversation of, okay, these in an ideal world are prosthetic applications, but then you are factoring in your shooting timeline, of what that shooting schedule looks like, heat, just all of the practicality of we want to make all the things in the world, but if it's never going to make it to camera, then there's no point, so sort of reverse engineering the idea of what's an easy option to put on quickly given costume coverage and so on and so forth, also that gives you enough depth that for some of the scenes where anybody's interacting with those ports, there's space to go, versus any time where he was exposing himself enough that we could see that it's his stomach with small prosthetic pieces on it. So we had built all of the different iterations of that, knowing full well that there were going to be days where we would have the time to put on a prosthetic and it made sense because of the interaction. And there were other days where it was just going to be a faster, we lovingly refer to them as like the skin vests, but it was just, we had the leeway of his costume and Vigo being an angel. And so we could just sort of zip him in and out. And then that way when, it was 45 degrees and he was having to run around in 800 layers of beautiful clothing, we could at least give him the breather of like, okay, it's lunch. Let's take this off with you now. Let's take this rubber sopping wet
vest off you.
Yeah. So yeah, in my mind, it's sort of the dance of sure, ideally it's forever a beautiful makeup that we can spend 800 hours putting on somebody, but that's not gonna happen on the day necessarily. So yeah, finding happy solutions.
Thank you both so much for giving me the combination of words skin vest. We'll never get over that.
That's trademarked, just so
Alex, Monica, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure talking to you both.
Thank you
so much.
And congratulations on your work on the film. It is truly impressive.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Robert, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. And I was privileged enough to see the film at its premiere in Cannes. So I wanted to kick off by asking you about your long-standing collaboration with David. How would you describe it, and how do you think it has evolved since you first started working together?
Hello, Anna. The first time that David and I worked together was on Crash, so 25 years ago, and it hasn't changed since. And David Cronenberg is one of those rare creatures who are remaining today in the business of making films. He's a master. There are not many. There are many filmmakers, but not many who are actually at the top of the craft the way he is. So the collaboration that we have is essentially we work closely together during the development phase and the casting and the major decisions that are all made before production begins. Choice of man, choice of key locations, choice of key crew, scheduling, those things. And then once production begins, it's David's show. And which is it's a rare pleasure for a producer to be able to know that everything is under control and in the best possible hands, and I can actually focus on other things. And then in post-production, it's more or less the same, other than spend some time in the editing room together. Talk things through, and very, very rare exception. I can't actually, over the years, we essentially agree that this is how things should unfold and how they should be. So it's a peaceful, collaborative circumstance that has not changed in the 25 years and 4 films that we have made together.
And would you say that kind of I'm always very genuinely curious about the relationship between a producer and a filmmaker, especially when it lasts over several projects and several years. Do you see as part of your role to protect David's vision, which is completely unique and has been so groundbreaking in so many different ways over the years?
Yeah, look, the interaction between producer and director varies, can vary quite dramatically depending on who's the director and who's the producer. And my relationship with David is unique, and it doesn't apply to my relationship with every other director. David, as you just pointed out, has a unique vision. Only Cronenberg can actually make a Cronenberg film. That is not necessarily true of every film and every filmmaker, but it is of him. So if one decides to make a film with Cronenberg, then you let Cronenberg make a Cronenberg film and do everything. My job is to do everything in my power to use your word to protect that vision and to allow it, really not so much protect it because it's not in danger. There's no one attacking it, but rather to enable it, to create the circumstances, situation where it can be, where the vision can unfold. So, that includes casting of actors who are at a level which allows which ensures that the film will be distributed worldwide, that it can be financed. Choice of where are we going to make this film? That has something to do with aesthetics and something to do with where is it financially feasible? Because if it's not feasible financially, it won't be made. So these kinds of things I consider them enabling more than protecting.
And can you mention a little bit the evolution of Crimes of the Future? I've read in several kind of interviews and write-ups that it was a project that was gestating for a while and then got put back in the drawer and then came back out of the drawer. What has been its journey to finally getting made now?
It has a very checkered past. As you put it, it has been in and out of the drawer several times. We were originally going to make it, I think it was 2002 or 2002, and then things came up, and then it was David who decided to do something else instead, and he went back into the drawer. Came back out again a few years later, only briefly, only to go back in again. It resurfaced again, I think it was a couple of years ago. I believe it was, I asked David to read it one more time. I was the champion of this project, even though it's David who wrote it, in that I thought this really deserves to be made. So he then reread it again, and then he called me back and he said, you're right. I don't know why we haven't made this film, but let's make it. And the reality of it was that even though it was written 20 years ago, the themes that it deals with and that it probes are, 20 years ago they would have been prophetic. Today it actually maybe no longer prophetic, but rather real. It's the world in which we are beginning to live. So things like the invasion of plastic in the food supply, it's now here upon us. So those kinds of themes are, I think, if anything, more relevant now than they would have been then, when it was just a vision of the future. So now Crimes of the Future is a little bit less about the future than it's about the present.
And can you speak to what was it that made you champion this film as it was getting put back in the drawer and taken out and then not kind of really gelling to become a reality? Kind of what made you keep coming back to this film and asking David to look at it again, to that it deserves to be made?
Well, I can only give you a really sort of primitive answer to your question, which is that I really like it. I had it impacted me when I first read it long ago, and every time since, whenever I've reread it, I thought, wow, this is there has never been a film like this made. That's to me kind of what turns me on, is making something that is not a formulaic rephrasing of what has come before.
And some people have described this film as a body horror, which I find interesting in a way. I understand why people say that, but I don't necessarily share that opinion. What has been some of the most interesting reactions to the film that have either moved or impacted you in some of the way, as as people around the world have been able to see Crimes of the Future?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's not a horror film. I don't think there is anything horrible about it, but you can put that label on it, body horror, but I don't think that would do the film much justice. There was some concern that during one or two scenes there would be extreme reactions in the audience, and maybe there'll be walkouts or people fainting, but none of that has happened. Or if it has, I wasn't there, so I don't know about it. But every time I've seen the film with an audience, there have not been any walkouts or any particular. I mean, I have seen audience members faint during scenes in films, but not this one.
Do you think you've mentioned that when you first read it, when it was first written, it felt very prophetic. Do you feel like the reaction to the film now, which does feel very, very of the moment, whether by accident or by design, it feels extremely zeitgeisty, for lack of a better word. Do you think that the audience now is ready to receive a film like this and to understand it in a way that maybe, had it been made 20 years ago, would have been more difficult?
Well, judging from reactions to date, I think the answer to that question is yes. I think it's more timely now and certainly more digestible for an audience than it might have been 20 years ago.
You mentioned a few times kind of the importance of cast, especially for a film like this. Can you talk a little bit about the putting together of a cast? Viggo Mortensen has worked with David Cronenberg a number of times. Their collaboration is very set. But can you talk about kind of putting together this ensemble almost of performers?
Well, Viggo was first in. And actually, he initially wanted to play a supporting role and didn't want to play the lead. That took some convincing on David's part. Anyway, so after Viggo, casting Leia and casting Kirsten and Scott and the rest, it kind of really gelled really quickly. I think in part because it's David Cronenberg, and I think in part because it was with actors. A lot of actors would like to work with Viggo. So between Cronenberg and Viggo, I think it was too attractive to turn down for anybody that we went to. So I mean, and those roles were cast very, very quickly after. And I did want to say, I thought that the two The two women leads in the film, Leia and Kirsten, were, I think, were spectacular. We, not that everybody else wasn't, but I thought we had. It was a, neither David nor I had ever worked with either of them, so it was, you don't quite know how things will turn out until you work with somebody. But I thought they were both of them, Leia and Kirsten, were like revelations. And neither of them had played a role like the one that they play in this film. They actually took these roles on and made them more robust than the page.
Robert, I'm really sorry we don't have more time with you, but thank you so much for making
thank
the
you,
time
Anna, for having me.
and for coming on board for this conversation.